Hi. The first slide I'm going to put up is for Bart and Jim and all my other classmates that are here. Of course you're not old. Nobody's old anymore. In my talk today, I'm going to do main part of it is going to sort of be a discussion of the art of cartooning, and that's the art of drawing, writing, and the all-important coming up with ideas. Cartoonists have a certain ambivalence about the idea of being called artists, whereas we're constantly angry that we don't get the respect. We're also so aware of the various pompous and self-important aspects of the word artist that we're in the middle someplace. The best cartoon about this ever done was done by Ed Fisher in The New Yorker in the 1950s. Why, no, I've never thought of putting funny little captions at the bottom. In his introduction, Bart told you a lot about my life, and that's what I'm going to talk about first. We cartoonists run into this problem all the time. There was once an op-ed in the New York Times, and the writer quoted an article by so-and-so, a book by so-and-so, and then he quoted something, and he said, as was shown in a recent New Yorker cartoon. It happened to have been mine, and I was very upset that my name wasn't used. But people, especially people in the press, have a way of treating the cartoons as if the magazine makes them. And the cartoonists the reason I started these series of interviews that Bart mentioned was to fight that anonymity a little. And in that vein today, I thought I'd tell you a few things about myself. I was born and raised in New York City, and that experience has shaped my worldview ever since. The sun rises on the Upper East Side and sets on the Upper West Side. Now, what was my childhood like? I think I captured it in this cartoon. Someday, this will all be yours. Now, my parents were Russian immigrants, and my childhood was steeped in that New York immigrant experience, something I tried to capture in this cartoon. The country Grandpa came from was a stinking hellhole of unspeakable poverty where everyone was always happy. I went to school in New York City, and like everyone, I had better luck with some subjects than others, but my problem actually went a little deeper. It may be wrong, but it's how I feel. So finally we come, after I left New York, to Williams. I am the class of '68, and while I was here, as Bart mentioned, I majored in history. I also studied political science, and I was a double major in French. And as I look back, I asked myself, I wound up doing something so silly with my life. Was that experience, that intense, fabulous education I got, a complete waste of time? But I realized as I look over my work that education has really affected my cartoons and informed them. For example, this next cartoon, because of my education, I'm able to make a very astute comment on the world situation, and even more than that, in this cartoon, I provide a solution to one of the world's most intractable problems. Why is it we never focus on the things that unite us, like falafel? In the same vein, my knowledge of history and political science has definitely informed the cartoons I've made about the current election campaign. I know. What if I promise them change? And I just want to say, I studied medieval history here with Francis Oakley, and I want you to know that accounts for the incredible accuracy in the weaponry, the architecture. As I said, I did major in French, and when I was here, I developed a goal that I was never able to complete while I was here. And in fact, for the rest of my life, I was really tormented by my failure to do so. But recently, I found a solution to the problem. That's the guy hired to read Proust for me. So, the 60s. I was in school here in the 60s, and it was a pretty crazy time. But now, from this vantage point, as I look back on that time, with all its turbulence, I think I've gained a greater understanding of what it was I was doing. Sure, I fooled around with drugs when I was your age, but that was to protest the war. Now, before I leave Williams in this talk, I have to say that there was one extremely perverse aspect to our education here, the lack of women. I had also gone to an all-boys high school, and so by the time I left here, I was pretty lost. You know, women here would arrive on the weekend in buses, dropped off at some parking lot, and the aggressive males would be in there, and I'd be standing off on the side with my Jewish afro, smoking a cigarette, thinking if I look really sensitive, a really sensitive woman who I could really care about will come over and start talking to me. Needless to say, I had very lonely weekends. But this experience, unfortunately, has left me with a lifelong struggle, especially with communicating with women. You haven't said anything for 10 years. Is everything okay? So after I left here and I went to graduate school at Harvard for a couple of years, and it didn't take me long to drop out. As soon as I got there, the 60s kind of opened up for me, and school just seemed too weird. And so the one problem that came up right away was, well, I lost my scholarship because I dropped out. How was I going to make a living? And for the one and only time in my life, at that point, I had what we might call a regular job. A problem showed up right away, however, that pretty much doomed that project. My boss is always telling me what to do. My 15 years in Boston were mixed. I can't say it was my favorite place, but I know that I developed a very deep understanding of the psyche of the people that live in that city. Rooting for them is a disease, Ben. It's nothing to be ashamed of. Just quickly, the president of the Red Sox once called me through the magazine and said he just loved my cartoons. I've done several about the Red Sox. And he said, I'd really like to have one of the original drawings, and in addition, offer you and your wife free box seats in my box anytime this summer. And oh, this is really fabulous. And then I made the stupid mistake of saying, this is so ironic. I'm a Yankee fan. Click. Anyway, in Boston, I developed a second career, which I lasted about 20 years, which was I became a painter and a sculptor as well. And that, too, I look back on now that I've dropped it and thought maybe I was wasting my time. But I feel sure now that I really learned how to communicate with imagery by doing that work. The artist is a deeply religious feminist and anti-smoking advocate who made a lot of money in the computer industry before going off to paint in Paris, where she now lives with her husband and 2 little girls. In 1983, I moved back to New York from Boston. It was great. I really needed to be there for my career. But the best thing that happened was that's when I met my wife when I moved back to New York. I had always imagined myself living in Manhattan in the center of everything, but my wife lived in one of the outer boroughs, and we moved in together, and I felt a little weird about it, but then actually wound up feeling pretty good about it. I live in the Brooklyn arrondissement. Ginny and I actually met because we were sharing rent on a house in a New England state north of here, which has played a very big role in my life ever since. Did we mention that we spent last summer in Maine? Now, there's one more thing before I leave the subject of my wife that I always say in these talks, which is the cartoons I do about married people in my cartoons, they are not autobiographical. They are not about me and my wife. And for instance, what's happening in this cartoon has never, ever happened in my marriage. Well, if it doesn't matter who's right and who's wrong, why don't I be right and you be wrong? Never happened. Well, in New York, it took me still over a decade I submitted cartoons to the New Yorker for 25 years before they bought the first one, and I must say that before this happened, there were times when I really had some dark thoughts. Then I thought, hey, hold on a minute, maybe failure is an option. But I did get into the magazine, and the last 12, 15 years have been a time of enormous growth for me. A lot of it has to do with I've changed how I live my life. How to be in the moment. How to be in the moment after that. I've taken up yoga, which has helped a lot. When did everybody stop jogging? So as I said, this is a time of evolution for me, and I tried to capture the feeling of that evolution in this cartoon. And so I ask myself at this point in my life, I'm now in my 60s, how is it that I'm able to make all these terrific changes so late in life when the early part of life was so much struggle? What is it? How am I able to do these new things? Thank goodness you're here. I can't accomplish anything unless I have a deadline. Now, like all of us, with age comes medical difficulties, aches and pains, but I have excellent care, and I have to mention that my favorite doctor is my esteemed classmate who's not here today, Dr. Michael Levin. And what I like about Michael and some of the other doctors I see is the way that they, first of all, are very conservative and won't do anything that's not necessary, and secondly, give you all the relevant information. I can cure your back problem, but there's a risk you'll be left with nothing to talk about. So, what do I have to look forward to? And finally, I really think I know what people will say about me after I'm gone. He's still in therapy. Thank you. Now I'll move on to the educational section of my lecture. First, I'm going to talk about cartoon drawing. And it's really impossible to separate drawing from writing from ideas. Cartoons are about all of that. And the best example of that is a cartoon like this one. This is by Anton Kavarsky. It's from the 50s also. And it shows you how the drawing itself can be the idea of the cartoon. We're in Japanese waters, that's for sure. All the cartoons I show you, I'm leaving out hundreds of cartoonists. I'm just showing you my favorites today to make my points. The New Yorker is filled with different drawing styles. Bart spoke at length about mine. And the drawing is really our voice. It's our way of telling a story. And there's no one better at telling story through pictures with a wonderful drawing than Charles Addams. Addams is the biggest influence over cartoonists. Everyone from Roz Chast to Gahan Wilson say that they started wanting to be a cartoonist by looking at Charles Addams when they were young. And Addams' work appeals to kids. It's very sick, and kids love that. But his work is so sophisticated, the beautiful, elegant washes that he uses. And he was a student of architecture, and he drew buildings as a hobby all the time. And you can see all the detail, attention to detail, and that the incredible composition, the point of view, the characters sort of used as props to create this composition. And the thing about Addams is that he believes in details and drawing, unlike some of us. Every little thing is accurate and in detail. And what's wonderful about that, it makes these preposterous things he depicts very believable. The context is so real. This next one is my all-time favorite. Now, besides being an incredibly silly drawing, some people who studied art history here are laughing louder than others because it's really about this. Remember that from Jansen? It's the Laocoon. And I show you this. What I find fascinating about this was done in the middle 50s, is that Addams felt truly confident, and the magazine felt confident, that the readers would understand it. At that point in time, that image was the kind of image that everybody connected to and understood, a cultural reference that everyone had. I always find that interesting. The next artist whose drawing I'm going to talk about is George Booth. George is in his 80s now. He's a very tall, courtly gentleman from Missouri. And, well, I'll start off just by showing you this world-famous cartoon of his. George has an incredible love of line, a joy in his drawing that is unmatched. And it's interesting because there really is no joke here. What's funny is George's incredible observation of reality and his recreation of it, as well as an amazing sense of comic timing. And George had a gift that no other cartoonist I know has. George's mother was a cartoonist, and his father ran a small-town newspaper, and when his mother encouraged him from the time he was 3 to draw cartoons, he was published at 5. So he has this, and actually his mother was also a teacher, and I often find it interesting. My mother was also a teacher. She quit her job not long after I was born so she could focus full-time on preventing me from being something like a cartoonist. So George has this, well, I'll show you another one of George's. Your car will be right down, Mr. Lundquist. Notice how, the precise, George told me that he worked a long time to get that car in exactly the right position relative to that vertical line. And what's wonderful about it is that car has about as much personality as any person or the dog in the previous one. Somehow he has a way of putting life into everything. I'll show you one more of his drawings. I want 2 days and 1 dazzling night on the Orient Express. This is one of a series of cartoons George does about loners, which I think has something to do with being a cartoonist, because it is a pretty isolated profession. I show you this only because we're all told, less is more in a cartoon. Don't distract with unnecessary things. Might distract from the joke. Here you see George, all the weirdness in George's drawing, that hammer and the nails into the floor. When I interviewed him, George said when he was a kid, he used to spend his time hammering nails in rows on the floor. So he just threw it in. But what's wonderful is, if you think about it, all that richness of detail gives you much more of a sense of the weird personality and character of this person. One of my favorite cartoonists, if not my favorite, is Robert Weber. Bob is in his mid-80s. He's been in the magazine since '64. He was a phone call. He was a fashion designer and a fashion illustrator, and came to cartooning and has become, in my opinion, the champion of a particular kind of drawing which is all about creating character by drawing the people in his cartoons in such a way that you really know what they're thinking and feeling. He's also a master of the charcoal pencil, and I'll just start off with showing you this one of Bob's. Okay, Willie, drag yourself to the table and collapse in despair. Enter Biff. You can see the wonderful work Bob does creating those lights and stuff, but what's really interesting is how you understand who everyone is in the drawing and what they're feeling, and he does it with such few strokes of the pencil. And Bob is a great believer in what he calls reality-based humor. He feels that the question you should ask yourself about a cartoon is, could it have really happened? That's the only thing that he finds funny, and to a large extent, I agree with him and admire that about his work. Here's another one of his, very appropriate for our current setting. Son, can you spare a couple of minutes to talk about your tuition? Again, look at every detail in the cartoon, the broken table leg, the drooping flowers, everything gives you a sense of who these people are, and then by contrast, the young kid, not a bad person, a little oblivious. It's beautifully rich. One more of Bob's. Bob, several years ago, had a serious hand injury and surgery on his drawing hand, and to this day now has to draw by grasping his pencil like this. But this next cartoon, which he did during that period, shows you how much of this character creation he has right in his hand. Nothing beats New York for sheer energy. So before I leave the subject of drawing, I wanted to show you two or three people who are in the magazine, younger people in the magazine right now, whose work I admire. The first is a person I think of as one of the heirs of Charles Addams, Frank Cotham. Fill out this tag and attach it to your big toe. Frank's work is very dark in the Addams tradition, but his drawing, the way he brings the white of the page into the drawing and all the blacks and whites and grays, is really, really a special talent. I love the way they look in the magazine because the whites of the page and the white in the drawing connect beautifully. The next two people I'm going to show you are two of my favorites, the younger generation. About their drawing, my editor calls them postmodern cartoonists. I don't even think he knows what he means, but I sort of understand that to mean they don't do cartoon drawing. The first one is Alex Gregory. Alex works entirely on the computer. He is a Hollywood screenwriter, and he doesn't really draw with his hand, and so there's a kind of flat, deadpan look to his work that some of my colleagues dismiss, but what's wonderful about it, I said that the most important thing about cartoon drawing is that it's in the service of the idea. If it communicates the idea, it's successful. Alex's ideas are very deadpan, and his drawing really works with it. In this next one, this is one of my all-time favorites, and it's my absolute favorite cartoon about art. What I do as an artist is to take an ordinary object, say a lamppost, and by urinating on it, transform it into something that is uniquely my own. Now I want to show you this next one. This is by Matt Diffie. Matt's in his 30s and new to the, well, he came aboard the same time I did 10 years ago. And Matt is a very, very talented guy. And I show you this cartoon of his. It's a famous cartoon because it's fun to think of this in relation to the Lacan Charles Addams I showed you, the whole issue of people being able to feel confident that their cultural references will be understood. Now, my own drawing, which Bart went on about quite a bit, is rooted in a different tradition in the magazine, a tradition begun by James Thurber. It's the simple line drawing, somewhat a kind of wonderful awkwardness in Thurber. What I like about the artist I'm about to show you is there's this sense that the idea and the drawing just happened. Not the Adamses are beautiful, but you can just imagine the amount of work that went into them. This feeling that you get an idea and you draw it. I love that style. It begins with Thurber. You wait here and I'll bring the etchings down. This is from the very beginning of the New Yorker. One of my favorite in this direct style of drawing, simple linear drawing, is Arnie Levin. Arnie, like George Booth actually, is an ex-Marine who started doing cartoons first in a Leatherneck magazine and has wound up being one of the greatest New Yorker cartoonists. First off, you're not a nut, you're a legume. The directness and loopiness of his line is just fabulous. And finally, if there's no one better at the awkward school of drawing, no one who's made more of a wonderful career out of it than Roz Chast. I'm going to show you this early, awkward Roz Chast. It's great, isn't it? You try to say the sounds to yourself, but it just doesn't work. Roz began in 1978 at the New Yorker. I had seen her work in other places, and she, of course, is a wonderful artist. When her work first appeared in the magazine got a lot of angry letters because people were upset because they said she couldn't draw, which is kind of interesting given that she's now the gold standard. And also, Mr. Shawn, the editor then, actually asked her, "How do you know they're cartoons?" Which I think is a wonderful indication of how inventive she is. No one had ever done something like this before. So finally we come to my drawing. My drawing also has been somewhat controversial. I like to tell the story that one of the great perks of being in the New Yorker is you get invited to the parties. The parties are the Thinking Man Celebrity Marathon. You're standing there, oh, who's that guy with the two babes? Philip Roth. Oh, look, there's John Updike. Oh man, I'm standing next to Salmon. Is that a good idea? At the first party I ever went to after I sold my first few cartoons, one of the great masters of the form came staggering up to me across the floor, his drink spilling everywhere. And I was just feeling great. It was like my first triumph I'd had in this area. And he came over to me and said, "I know who you are." I said, "Oh, great, he knows who I am." He said, "You don't belong in the New Yorker. What do you draw with, a stick?" Now, needless to say, it was painful and difficult. It took me a few years to process it, but I finally triumphed over that experience, I feel, with this cartoon, which is in the cartoon issue in 2004. Bad drawing. So now I'm going to move on to talk a little about cartoon writing. My favorite cartoon about all that is this one by Barney Toby from the 60s. Then what happened? That's what we cartoonists do with our writing. We complete the story. And part of it is writing captions. Captions they're a lot harder than they look. It's a question of getting the right rhythm, not having anything in the dialogue that disrupts or breaks up the joke. And cartoon writing is also about something more than that. It's the whole sort of creation of the narrative, including the idea and the drawing. So that really good cartoon writing can include a cartoon that has no writing at all, such as this one by Chande. It's got a beginning, a middle, and an ending, right? This one by Peter Arno from the 40s, I think, is the only words are right in the drawing, and so cartoon writing in a very minimal form is happening here. I put this up for two reasons. One, what you experience in this cartoon is the kind of timing that makes cartoons happen. The words, the picture, there's a little timing glitch between the two, and that's where the humor lies. I think I've discovered after giving many of these talks that that's what the audience experiences, because especially when they're big and blown up, you can't look at the two things simultaneously. Also, I put an Arno up because Arno is one of the great New Yorker artists who never thought up a single idea of his own. Most, if not all, New Yorker cartoonists until the mid-50s were artists. They did the drawings. The ideas came from other cartoonists or from what they call gag men, or else actually various editors of the magazine in their spare time would sit around coming up with ideas or captions. And Charles Addams is, I'm pretty sure, today cartoonist Leo Cullum, Gahan Wilson, bunch of others started their career writing gags for Charles Addams. He did some of his own, but a lot of his cartoons were written by other people. My favorite one-word minimal writing cartoon, and my second favorite cartoon about art of all time, is this one by Charles Martin. Nancy! If George Booth is the champion of more is more in drawing, he also does a more is more thing in writing. And this is a wonderful, very long caption, beautifully written with a kind of wonderful rhythm. And it includes a trick we all use in our captions, the kicker at the end. I've got an idea for a story. Gus and Ethel live on Long Island on the North Shore. He works 16 hours a day writing fiction. Edith never goes out, never does anything except fix Gus sandwiches. And in the end, she becomes a nympho-lesbo-killer whore. And then the wonderful, here's your sandwich. Now, as I say, I admire musicality and poetry in caption writing. In one of my cartoons, I actually focused on a poetic device, alliteration. I feel this one is especially musical. Can you recommend a large-breasted burgundy with a big behind? A lot of cartoon writing means paying attention to what's being said, not just to the conversations you're in, but to what's being said in the culture. And one of the great arts of cartoon writing is taking those phrases that become so standard in our culture and hang like ripe fruits for the cartoonist, filled with potential humor. Good example of this one is by Bob Minkoff, who is the cartoon editor. Frankly, I've repressed my sexuality so long, I've actually forgotten what my orientation is. As I said before, I personally prefer cartoons that are rooted in reality. Sometimes people make wonderful cartoons in the magazine, but the people in them are sort of just vehicles for the joke. That can be done very well, and the person who's made a career out of it is Bruce Kaplan, Bruce Eric Kaplan, B-E-K. Bruce's work is very clever. It's not my favorite kind of cartoon, and I'm just going to show you one of Bruce's. You'll have to excuse me, I'm myself today. You can see that this is a clever trick. What he's done is removed a word you'd expect to see. I'm not myself today. And I show it in comparison in this next cartoon. I'm going to show you one more by Roz Chast. And here, notice how the way these people speak, it gives you so much information about who they are, and actually a lot of information on who the writer is, just in the way she puts the words together. Dream parents. Oh, you definitely look like a cheap slut in that. Have fun. See you whenever. You're going out with Johnny? Ooh, I saw his name in the police log. He's famous. So in the end, great cartoon writing and great cartoon drawing, when they work together, there's a kind of incongruity of the two that is so funny. And I thought I would just show you two of my all-time favorite cartoons that absolutely have a wonderful relationship between the two. This first one is by Levi Wrens, who was a long-time cartoon editor who rejected me for 25 years. But I love his work. It appears to be Shiva manifesting himself as Lord of Destruction, but why he's in Hartsdale on a Thursday night is beyond me. And finally, this classic by Danny Shanahan, caption drawing perfect relationship. You slept with her, didn't you? Now we come to the third part of the cartoon creative process. The question cartoonists hate to be asked, where do you get your ideas? I've interviewed many people. Everybody has a different story, a different method. Some people are reluctant to talk about it because in the end it is a sort of magical thing and it's best not to examine it too closely. Roz Chast likes to collect millions of little pieces of paper. She writes down anything that comes into her head before she sits down to work. Sam Gross, the wonderful cartoonist Sam Gross, doodles, and his ideas come from his drawing. Another artist I love in The New Yorker, I don't have any of her slides today, is Barbara Smaller. Barbara works in a coffee shop on the Upper West Side. She never works at home, and for her the ideas come from listening to the chatter in the coffee shop. So everybody has a different approach. I thought I would, start by showing you this, which a lot of it is a lot of this. This is by Mick Stevens. There's a lot of sitting and staring into space, waiting for something to pop into your head. And rather than go through all these different artists, I thought I'd tell you a little about my own process of coming up with ideas. This is a drawing that I did several years ago that I looked at for days. I knew there was a cartoon. I knew there was an idea in there, but I couldn't find it. This is a little like the caption contest at the end of the magazine. It's what cartoonists do all the time. Finally, one day, I came up with what I thought was the perfect caption and was thrilled. I ran out of room. So sometimes I begin with drawing, other times I begin with words. There is a particular bunch of words that I've always found hilarious, and I knew that I could make a cartoon out of them if I could only figure it out. This process is really a lot, as a cartoonist, you feel like it's a math problem, you know there's a solution. It's not like there's no solution. I knew that there was a cartoon in this, and also with these words. Are we there yet? Not only did I finally come up with a drawing to fit this, but over the years in The New Yorker, I am the only cartoonist in the history of the magazine who had 3 cartoons with exactly the same caption. The first one was my first cartoon that I published in July of 1998. Are we there yet? This next one from about 3 years ago. Are we there yet? And finally, this one from very recently. Are we there yet? Most of the time, the process is very deliberate. I often go into work and have something I really want to make a cartoon about, and if it takes me all day, I'm going to do it. So I'm beginning with a thought, not with writing, not with drawing, but a thought. I recently joined a very bizarre reading group. There are about 6 or 8 of us, Jews, reading the New Testament and discussing that hilarious document. And I really, really wanted to do a cartoon about it. It took me a while, and I was so pleased when I came up with this one. Quit worrying about corroborating your sources. It's not as if anyone's going to take all this literally. I like the halo. I also worked really hard on that camel. So that's one way it happens, deliberatively, but there's a much more common and really the most delightful way cartoons ideas come. We are, in a certain way, cartoonists always have their cartoon brain on, and we're always being attentive to our own life because that's where the cartoons happen. Several years ago, my wife and I were in Washington, D.C., walking around, and it was before a particular retail store became so, there were none of them in New York at the time. And I found walking around very confusing in Washington, D.C., and came up with this cartoon on the street, on the spot, fully formed in my head. Are we in this Starbucks or the one down the street? The very best and most intoxicating idea generation happens through something I think of as a misdirection experience. It's as if the cartoon happens to you and you didn't think it up, and it's a wonderful, thrilling thing, and it actually makes you laugh just the way the viewer laughs when they see it for the first time. An example, recently I went into my studio absolutely committed to making a cartoon about the war in Iraq. And I worked and worked and worked all day, and nothing was happening. I couldn't make it happen. And finally I thought, you know what I need to do? I need to go home and turn on, Chris Matthews, or just watch cable news for a while, and something will happen. And then I thought, damn, we're having this work done in our apartment, and the TV is all put away. I can't do that. And then suddenly, just at that moment, I looked down on my pad, and it almost sort of appeared by magic was this cartoon. Our dream is to live long enough to see the end of our renovation. One of the ways we structure our idea search is with the cliches. You all are familiar with them: the desert island, the people at the bar, the pearly gates. These themes have been done over and over in the history of the magazine, and it's wonderful for cartoonists because at some point it can focus your search for ideas if you put it in one of these contexts. And we're always trying to push it to the limit and do what no one else has done. Here are 2 great desert island cartoons 50 years apart. The first one by Charles Addams. By George O. Wright. I thought there was something familiar about it. And then this one from just a couple of years ago by a young cartoonist named Eric Lewis. I'm dating a turtle, Hank. If you've got a better cry for help, I'm all ears. Several years ago, we did a show called Cartoonists Unleashed at the New Yorker Festival, and we played improvisational games. I had 15 cartoonists on stage, and they had a high-speed caption contest, which they had 10 seconds to come up from an image with caption. And then we did this. The audience would choose one from column A, one from column B, one from column C, and we'd make cartoons about it. And it's actually a really good example of how these cliches work for us, because you can start putting them together yourself. Just before I was looking at the robber, the lawyer, and the pearly gates, and the robber would say something like, "He's just here to present my case and then he's going to hell." But you can start putting these together yourself, a waiter and a scientist in bed, and cartoons can happen that way. Finally, about ideas, really the most mentioned source of ideas, to use a very strange word, are feelings. People come into their studio, as I do, sometimes very angry about something, and it's not as if the cartooning is a therapy, but it is a way of processing or that feeling, sometimes getting back at what's causing that feeling. And anger is a very common one, and for me, it usually revolves around topical issues. This cartoon was definitely rooted in anger. Psst, quit taking insurance, pass it on. Another one, a political cartoon, and I'll talk a minute about political cartoons in the New Yorker. This was also at a time when I was extremely pissed off. You know who's a big pain in the ass? Europe. The New Yorker has David Remnick, our editor, does not like quote-unquote political cartoons, editorial cartoons. But you can get stuff in there. It's an art in and of itself. Part of the deal is you can never advocate for something. You just have to sort of sit back one step removed and say, look how ridiculous it all is. They do not allow caricature of politicians in the cartoon. So you notice I drew our president from the back. That was my trick there. If anger is a source of cartoons, much more so anxiety. Roz Chast often says she grew up reading the Merck Manual when she was a kid. And getting scared and anxious is a wonderful source of cartoons. And it's quite seriously, I think it's the thing I most go to when I try to work. My favorite of the anxiety-based cartoons is the famous Gahan Wilson. And this is maybe some of you know Gahan's work from the Playboy and the New Yorker. I first discovered him the same time I discovered breasts, which at the barber shop, when I was a kid, there was always a Playboy, and Gahan was in it, and breasts were in it. So this is a wonderful cartoon of Gahan's, just rooted in his anxiety. What I like about Gahan, I showed you Charles Addams, and Gahan is often talked about as sort of the heir to Charles Addams. Addams never seemed really scared of the scary things he put in his cartoons. He was very clever, and he did wonderful depictions of situations that he had no emotional investment in. Every time Gahan does a scary cartoon, you can tell Gahan is scared too. Finally, now that I've covered all of that, I have one more topic, which is being funny. Now, there's a famous quote, you all know it, by E.B. White. Humor can be dissected as a frog can, but the thing dies in the process. So I've really taken a risk today trying to examine what makes things funny. I have one little theory of my own, which is that humor, at least in cartoons, is a melding of something very familiar and something very surprising, a juxtaposition of incongruous things that you can say to yourself, oh, I can relate to that, and also, wow, I've never seen that before. And I'm going to show you three of my all-time favorite cartoons by three of my all-time favorite cartoonists, where the humor is in that wonderful combination of familiar and unfamiliar. This is my favorite Roz Chast cartoon. Obituaries. 2 years younger than you, 12 years older than you, exactly your age. 3 years your junior, 5 years your senior, your age on the dot. We've all had that feeling, and it's just wonderful that she puts it in this surprising context. This next one is by the great cartoonist Sam Gross. I wish I could have shown more of Sam's, but this is it's just wonderful. I don't care if she is a tape dispenser. I love her. And finally, this one by Danny Shanahan. Thanks for almost everything, Dad. And in the end, deciding why something's funny is a mystery, really. And the next cartoon I'm going to show you is, I've never been able to figure out why I love it and why it's so funny, but I own the original of it. The artist gave it to me, and I'm very proud of it. This one by Bob Weber. Did I say Henny Youngman? I meant to say Sergei Prokofiev. So in the few minutes left, a couple of minutes, I'm just going to talk to you a little about the process of the New Yorker, how it works for us. I think I said before, it took me 25 years to get in the magazine. I had always wanted to do this. Before I came to Williams and became a history student, I was a kid at home drawing cartoons. My mother always used to report that I would cut them out and paste them over the cartoons in the magazine when I was a kid. It was my secret ambition, but it was not considered a proper ambition for a young Jewish man. So I've always been in love with the magazine and always been in love with the cartoons. And my opportunity came when the old cartoon editor, Levi Wrens, was replaced by the current editor, Bob Minkoff, in 1998. I sold my first one. This will give you some sense of why a friend of mine said, cartooning is a profession where you can be out of work and not know it. It's terribly freelance, and the odds are unbelievable. In fact, my editor, cartoon editor, looks at about 1,000 cartoons a week, from which ultimately 15 are chosen. Another way to look at it is I do hand in about 1,000 cartoons a year, and I sell between 35 and 40. So as Charlie Barsotti, the great cartoonist, said, what happens is that we bring in our roughs, drawings. In my case, my roughs look remarkably like my finishes. We bring them in on Tuesday, or you fax them in or email them in. And if you go in on Tuesday, you have the opportunity of sitting down with the editor and as he goes through your work, which is the editor, Bob Minkoff, cartoon editor, which is extremely painful and humiliating. And so you don't have to do that. You can just hand them in. Some people seem addicted to the humiliation. I'm not. He then so that's about 1,000 that he looks at. He then culls them down to somewhere between 35 and 50. And then on Wednesday afternoon, he meets with David Remnick, the editor of The New Yorker, and they choose from those, actually David chooses from those 35, the ones they're going to buy, the 15 or so that they're going to buy that week. Meanwhile, here's what's happening with the cartoonists. We go in on Tuesday, we show our work to Bob, and then we go to the all-important, world-famous, 80-year-old cartoonist lunch. We all go out to lunch on Tuesday. We go to a restaurant called the Pergola des Artistes on 45th Street in the Theater District, where they have a $8.95 special and a free glass of wine. And we go as a group and complain and kvetch, and it's always nice to get out of the isolation. But then everybody walks out ready for what happens next, which is the waiting. The magazine calls you if you've sold a cartoon. They don't call you if you haven't. Now some of you may remember this emotional state from dating. A lot of staring at the phone that never rings. Or it does ring, but you don't know when it's going to ring. So, the editorial assistant had a cold and he was out for 2 days, and while you were practically slitting your wrist because you didn't sell one, he really had a cartoon sale for you, but he didn't call till Monday. So it's very painful, and they refuse to make it easier for us. Finally, you get the call if you've sold a cartoon, which is wonderful, and then you have this pile of 900 rejections in the period of a year. A friend of mine, Matt Diffie, who I showed you his cartoon of Che Guevara, Matt had a wonderful idea several years ago and started publishing these books called the Rejection Collection. I don't know if you've seen any of them, but they include rejected cartoons by New Yorker cartoonists. And it's just a mystery why they rejected some of them. For example, this one of mine from the book, I just can't imagine why they rejected it. What's wonderful about doing these talks is when the cartoons or the magazine, we kind of drop them into a big hole and we never get to hear people respond. I love hearing your response. I've often, on the subway in New York, I've followed someone long past my stop as they went through the magazine, waiting for them to see if they laugh. It's great to be in the New Yorker. One does occasionally get hate mail, and I thought I'd end with this interesting development. This is a cartoon I had in a couple of years ago. Oh, okay. Well, I'm going to show you this final slide, thank God, which is the letter that I got about this. In the current issue of 227, I see a cartoon, well, I can't read, I see it, of an elderly woman who, noting the declining height of an elderly man, we might presume her husband. They are both white, of course, and this is the male who is declining, of course. Another joke on old white males, ha ha, the wit. Here's another joke. Imagine William Shawn, that's the old editor, allowing this cartoon in print. Ha ha, that is funny. It's nice, I'm sure, to be young and rude. But someday you'll be old, unless, as of my wish, you drop dead first.